Good afternoon. Welcome to another one of our Wednesday afternoon Roosevelt Facebook Live sessions. On behalf of our library director, Paul Sparrow, I want to welcome you all here, and also for the library's staff, welcome. And I'm Jeff Urban, the education director at the Roosevelt Presidential Library, and today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression. So settle in, get your iced tea ready, and we'll go on a journey of talking about the Great Depression of the 1930s. And Roosevelt's response to that. Now, when we talk about the Great Depression and teach it to our students, we usually focus on the Great Depression as an economic problem. You know, the stock market collapsed. And if we ask people, you know, when did the Great Depression start? They're probably going to say October 29th, 1929. But it started well before that, and there were some forces and influences that were coming about that were leading up to the stock market crash in October of 29. So we're going to take a little look at those, and then we're going to look at Roosevelt's response to that as well. Now, when we teach this about the Great Depression and the stock market crash, you know, we say, oh, it was a Great Depression. It was hard times. People were suffering. But we really need to understand that. You know, when we look back 10, 12 years ago to the Great Recession was a picnic compared to the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a global economic depression. It wasn't just being felt here in the United States. It was being felt around the world. At the peak, farms were failing at 1,000 farms each month. Banks were failing almost the same rate, 1,000 a month. The unemployment rate averaged 25% in the United States, 1 out of every 4 people out of work. And that's an average. It was as high as 60% in some places and in some industries. And we teach this as an economic problem, but it was really an emotional problem and a spiritual problem as well. Because during the Great Depression, people lost hope. Families collapsed in on themselves. Children were sometimes abandoned at post offices or government buildings, or maybe signed into an orphanage because their parents couldn't afford to feed them. And they figured, well, if we do this, at least they'll have something to eat and they'll be safe. If you had an elderly family member, they might be asked to move in with you to help make ends meet so they didn't have to struggle on their own. So sis might suddenly discover grandma living in her room along with her. Young men were sent out of the family, often to find work and fend for themselves. And this led to the hobo culture, with probably 2 to 3 million young men riding the rails all across the country, looking for work, going from town to town. Churches, charities, villages, cities, counties, states were all tapped to their potential in terms of helping folks out. And so there was no place to turn except for the federal government. And people who lived through the Great Depression, well, it changed their lives. People that came out the other end were never quite the same. And I can give you an example of that with my own personal experience. My grandmother had lost some money in a bank run during the Great Depression. And whenever you see a picture of my grandma, she's always got this big black pocketbook. And so, you know, there's grandma going to church. She's got the big black pocketbook. There's grandma coming out of the casino, big black pocketbook. There's grandma being brought in for questioning on the disappearance of my grandpa, big black pocketbook. They later found him. I said to my mother, you know, there's grandma with her great big pocketbook all the time and all these pictures. And my mom said, well, you know what she had in there, don't you? And I said, well, no, I don't. She said, about $30,000. $30,000? What was she doing with that? Well, she had lost money at a bank run during the Great Depression, and she never trusted banks again. She lived all the way on up into the 1980s, and she clutched that pocketbook all the way. So the problem with the Great Depression was that not only was it a severe economic problem for the United States, it was a severe economic problem for the world, but it was also this emotional and spiritual problem as well. People lost hope. They saw no way out. They saw no end in sight, nowhere to turn. And the federal government at that point seemed to be unwilling or unable to help. And it all came after a decade of pretty good living. The 1920s, right? The Roaring '20s. Well, during this time, they asked the famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, have we ever seen anything like this before? And Keynes said, yes, we have. It was called the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. So that'll give you an idea of how things were during the Great Depression. Now, the flashpoint is October 29th, 1929, when the stock market crashes, but the causes of the Great Depression were developing well before that. And one particular cause started almost 10 years before the rest of the nation felt the Great Depression, and that was for farmers. There was a farm crisis. There was a giant drought, the Dust Bowl, out in an area of the country that covers parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, that area out there. And the farmers out there experienced an incredible drought, a drought so severe that the crops failed and the soil literally turned to dust. Farmers tried to grow more crops, figuring, all right, if we grow 100 acres, maybe 10 of it will be okay. And that just led to over farming on top of everything else. And the soil was so depleted that there were times when the wind would come through, pick up this dust, blow it across the country, and places like Washington and New York would have their skies blacked out by the dust that was blowing through. Sometimes cattle would suffocate from black lung from breathing in the soil and the dirt that was being sent around. So the Great Depression started for farmers well before it did for the rest of the country. And this is important because at that time, about 50% of the population were farmers. So if you've got 50% of the population having that kind of a drastic problem that was partly man-made from the over-farming and partly nature from the drought, you're going to have a huge impact on the rest of your economy. We also reached what was called market saturation. All throughout the 1920s, people, for the most part, were doing pretty well. And they were buying things like radios and vacuums and, having phones installed and cars, those sorts of things. Well, there's only so many phones you can have in your house. There's only so many radios. There's only so many cars. And so the demand for these goods began to drop. And factories began to lay people off. Well, we don't need as many workers here to make these cars because everybody's pretty much got one and that's going to have one now, and we don't have to continue that. So the market saturation led to an employment problem and also a thing called deflation because the prices began to fall there as well. There was a world banking crisis that was going on, and this is why it was a global economic depression. And a lot of that stemmed from the end of the First World War. Germany was forced to pay reparations back to England and France, and England and France had borrowed money from the United States to fight the war. And since Germany wasn't able to make its payments, France and England weren't able to make their payments. And so the entire world global banking system was in a very tipsy position, to say the least. There was also problems on Wall Street. Throughout the 1920s, Wall Street had done pretty well, and people began to get into Wall Street. Ordinary people who really had no business being there, people who didn't really understand the market or the market mechanisms. And so people began to do what was called buy on margin. And buying on margin can happen generally in two ways. One is when you borrow money to get into the stock market. So I go to my neighbor because I got a great tip on a stock from my brother-in-law. I go to my neighbor and I say, look, there's this great stock. I need $100 to buy it. Lend me the $100. I'll buy the stock. When it goes up to 150, I'll come back. I'll give you the original 100 plus 20 for your trouble, and I'll make a $30 profit. Well, that's great so long as the stocks go up. If the stocks don't go up, then how am I going to pay back my neighbor, right? I'm not going to be able to do that. So I'm going to lose money, and he's going to lose money as well. The brokers were so intent on making money in the market that they would allow people to get into the market with only a down payment on the actual cost of the stock. So if it was a $100 stock, they might take a $10 down payment, figuring, all right, when everything goes up, I'll get the rest of that, but they were making the commission in the meantime. And so you had a lot of irregularities, let's say, in the stock market, and in some cases, downright fraud, people just, misrepresenting what a stock was likely to do. And then you had the bank crisis. And the bank crisis stemmed from the fact that people were needing to get their money out of the bank in order to make ends meet, pay the rent, buy the food, that sort of thing. And the banks were unstable. Many of the banks didn't have enough in reserve for folks to come in and get their money. And that's exactly what happened to my grandma. So as more people came in to get their money, the banks began to run out of the money. And once that got out, they would have runs on banks where hundreds of people would run in, and whoever got their money first got their money. After that, the door shut, and that was it. And you were out of luck. So when you put all these things together, the natural disaster, the human greed, buying on margin, the market saturation, the world banking crisis, the American banking crisis, all these things come together and they create the Great Depression. Now, poor President Hoover. President Hoover gets the blame on a lot of this Great Depression, but it really isn't fair. Hoover was a man who was sort of at the crossroads of all of these forces that were coming together all at the same time. We had never experienced anything like that before. Nobody really knew how to handle a Great Depression. There had been depressions in the past, but nothing on the size or scale of the Great Depression. And so when Hoover tried to do things, it ended up pretty much being a little too little, a little too late. And as a result of that, the conditions in the country got worse and worse and worse. And in fact, Hoover was not known as a particularly dynamic guy. It was in his nature and his political philosophy to sort of let things happen and let the market mechanism take care of things themselves. Prior to President Hoover, the federal government's job was mostly national defense and post office. So he didn't see a huge role of the government getting in there and beginning to, take control of this the way that we now understand government to work. And by the time that he did begin to see the writing on the wall, it was simply too late. Now, any Democrat who was running against Hoover could probably have beaten him. It happened to be Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt was the governor of New York State, and New York State was the largest state in the Union at the time. And if you were running New York State, you were basically running a small country on your own, right? I mean, the economy was big enough in New York State that it was larger than some countries in the world. So Roosevelt had this little dress rehearsal of being the governor of the state of New York in the first 4 years of the Great Depression. And as a result of that, he was able to try out some of what we now know as the New Deal programs here as small experiments in New York State first. And so the idea of a New Deal comes in Roosevelt's acceptance speech, where he says, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people. But it wasn't like the New Deal was a plan. He didn't really have a well laid out plan of what the New Deal was. It was more of a concept, sort of a bag of tricks that he knew would work on the state level and he hoped would work at the federal level. So the press picked this up as sort of an early soundbite, and they ran with this. Roosevelt promises New Deal, New Deal. So what becomes the New Deal? Well, we have to wait 6 months to find out. Because back in those days, the elections were held in November, and you didn't get to become president, you didn't get sworn in until March. So the country had a 6-month period there where Hoover was technically still president, but he was essentially powerless because by this time people had given up on him. Let me show you a picture of some of the conditions people were living in. This is an area right outside of New York along the East River. The East River is up here in the back. And these were areas that were called Hoovervilles. And these were conditions where people had lost their homes, and so they were living in shacks. They were cobbling together places to stay out of the elements with cardboard or metal sheeting or anything they could find. And they were often referred to as Hoovervilles because everybody blamed Hoover for having to live in these places and such. So Roosevelt is president. He's been elected, but he hasn't taken power yet. And so the country gets into an even more desperate spiral within that 6 months, waiting for FDR to come to power. Now, it almost doesn't happen. When Roosevelt's waiting to become president, he goes to Florida to rest up and sort of recharge before he takes on this mission of saving the country. And he's down there on St. Valentine's Day, and there's an assassination attempt on his life. And what happens is he's addressing a speech in Miami, an audience in Miami giving a speech, and he's up on the back of his car. He slides back down, and the press says, "Oh, Mr. President, would you get back up there for a minute, so we can take a picture?" And he says, "No, boy, sorry, I can't." And just then, shots ring out, and a guy by the name of Giuseppe Zangarin opens fire on the presidential motor car. And what happens is the mayor of Chicago is struck by one of the bullets. Now, I have to explain, he was standing next to the car. I was talking about this with students once, and I said that, shots were fired in Miami, and the mayor of Chicago was hit, and the students were amazed at, what a tremendous shot that must have been to hit somebody that far away. But that's not really what happened. He was standing next to the car that Roosevelt was in. And so the car took off, and the president said, "Oh, was anybody hit? What happened? Somebody took a shot at you." "Well, who got hit? Anybody?" And it's Mayor Shermack. So he drove back around, forced him to drive back around, and he drove Mayor Shermack to the hospital. The mayor died just a few weeks later. This gave Roosevelt this near miss with death before he had even stepped into the national, power. It gave him an aura of invincibility. It gave him a sense of, well, maybe some kind of divine providence was taking care of him and bringing him to us, saving him so that he could come and save us. And Roosevelt took full advantage of this. Now, Hoover tried to work with Roosevelt during this period, but Roosevelt wanted a clean slate when he got to office. And by Inauguration Day, they rode to the Capitol to do the transfer of power, and they were barely even speaking to each other at that time. Now, Roosevelt gets up there, takes the reins of power. It's March 4th, 1933, and he says the famous words, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And that becomes, this iconic statement in American history. At the time, it was a bit downplayed because he later in the speech had asked for, he was going to ask Congress for the power as if we were in wartime to fight this great economic disaster. And that got most of the applause at the time. But over the course of time, nothing to fear but fear itself has become sort of the iconic phrase from that. And I've always admired that and wondered about that, because if you think about a country that has 25% unemployment, banks are failing at 1,000 a day, farms are failing at 1,000 a day, people are out of work. The suicide rate during the Great Depression tripled because people just lost hope. And you've got this new president up there, and they're saying the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. You might think this guy's crazy, right? Fear itself. I've got to worry about how to feed my family. I've got to worry about where I'm going to sleep tonight. I've got to worry about if I'm ever going to have a job again. This is the kind of thing that was going through people's minds. But when Roosevelt said these words, they felt that he was speaking directly to them. And they felt that he had a vision, an idea, a goal of where he wanted the country to be. And people felt calmed by that. People felt nurtured by that. People felt as if we had somebody that was going to take charge and had some ideas about how to do it. And so that's where FDR began to change America right then and right there. Within 28 minutes of stepping to the podium, he gives this speech, and things begin to change in the nation. There's a shift from hopelessness to hopefulness, and there's a shift from inaction to action. And in fact, the very next day, on March 5th, the president calls the Congress in for a special session of Congress. And there he announces the next day that there's going to be a bank holiday. The banks are going to shut down for a week. And the government is going to go through, take a look at their books, see which ones are solvent, which ones are not. And if they're good, they can reopen. If they can't, if they aren't, they'll stay closed, and we'll work through it from there. So March 4th, he takes power. March 5th, he calls in the Congress. March 6th announces the bank holiday. By March 9th, he passes the Bank Act, which takes just hours to go from his desk through the House, through the Senate, and back to his desk for signature. And then on March 12th, he gives the first of what's called, or come to be called, a fireside chat. And he addresses the nation. And people all across the country settle down next to their radios, and they listen to Franklin Roosevelt as he begins to explain what he's done in the last few days, and talking about the bank holiday. 60 million people listened to that broadcast, it's estimated. And he spoke in a very folksy, friendly, informal tone. My friends, I want to talk to you tonight about banking. And he explained how the banking system worked. And people began to feel like he was talking directly to them and explaining to them what he had done, explaining to them what had gone wrong, explaining how what he had done was going to correct what had gone wrong. And people felt comforted by that. People felt as if the president was speaking to them and bringing them in on the fix, on how to fix the problem. And within a week, billions of dollars flowed back into the banks, not grannies, but other folks took their monies out of their mattresses, from out of their socks, and put them back into the banks, which immediately solved the bank crisis for the time being. So now the banks had money they could lend out for people to pay rent, to buy food, and eventually start businesses and those things as well. Now, building on this momentum, like this first week or two in office, President Roosevelt then introduces 16 major pieces of legislation. And this is all within the first 100 days. So, 80 years ago, we were in the first 100 days and Roosevelt was passing this legislation. And, when I say that, it makes some sense. But when you see it listed out, 100 days of action from March 9th to June 16th, all these things passed. The Emergency Banking Act, the Government Economy Act, the Abandonment of the Gold Standard, Homeowners Loan Act, Glass-Steagall Banking Act, Civilian Conservation Corps, Tennessee Valley, Emergency Mortgage, and of course, down here, Prohibition, the Beer, Wine, Revenue Act, right? So, he was repealing Prohibition with that. Of course, took an actual constitutional amendment to repeal the first constitutional amendment. But what he was allowing people to do was to produce near beer, and this, of course, gave farmers, now they could grow hops. Brewers were back in business. Truckers were back in business. Bars were back in business, and of course, the government was taxing every step along the way, and so we were increasing and generating some revenue there as well. 16 major pieces of legislation. Them for banking, some of them for farming. Those were the two most immediate crises, right, because of the Dust Bowl and because of the bank crisis. And it gave people a sense, hey, things are happening. Things are really working out here. Now, this was done in part because there was a huge wave of Democrats elected along with Roosevelt. So he did have Democratic support in the Congress to be able to do this. But the much of the support was bipartisan because things were just so bad and something had to be done. Now, he would go on beyond this 100 days where he created the 16 major pieces of legislation and then also issued executive orders and things on top of that. So there was a lot of activity, the most legislative active period in American history. And then he would go on to create other programs as part of this New Deal. Now, if you ask the average person, can you name some New Deal programs? They might say, let's see, New Deal, WPA, that's good, yeah, WPA, ESPN, no, QVC, no, CNN, no, right? Most people can't name more than one or two of the New Deal programs. But in fact, Roosevelt created over 44 programs of the New Deal. And you've probably seen that periodic table of the elements that the scientists have. Well, we've got one in social studies here too, in history. And this is the periodic table of the New Deal. And it shows the 44 programs that Roosevelt created over the course of the New Deal, some of the major folks who were involved in that, and some of the major crises and things that these programs were designed to bring about. And the thing that ties together all of the New Deal programs are simply the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Right? So when we talk to students about, the New Deal programs, we're not so impressed if they can list off 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 of them. That's good if you can do that. But what's more important is to understand the concept behind all of these programs. And that was relief, recovery, and reform. Relief. How do we bring about immediate assistance? How do we get you in a warm place to sleep tonight? How do we get you some food in your stomach? How do we get you off the street and into some kind of a shelter? That's relief. Recovery. You farmers out there, how do we get you back on the farms, back behind the plows? Teachers, how do we get you back into the classrooms? Factory workers, how do we get you back behind the machine in the factory? How do we get people back in their homes? So this is the idea of recovery. How do we get things back to normal? And then the third part of this, the third R, was reform. How do we prevent things from happening again? Now, if you listen carefully to what I just said a moment ago, how do we bring about immediate relief? How do we get people the things they need today? How do we get farmers back on the farms, teachers back in the schools? These are some of the same kinds of questions we're asking today, right? In the present crisis that we're having with the pandemic. So imagine, the questions you have in your mind. When is it going to end? How did this thing happen? Why wasn't more done to prevent it? Why isn't more being done to correct it? When do we get out of the lockdown? How do we get out of the lockdown? What's going to happen? What's the new normal? If you're asking yourselves these same kinds of questions, these are the same exact types of questions people were asking themselves during the Great Depression. How do we get into this mess? How do we get out of this mess? What's the new normal? How do I get immediate assistance, immediate relief? Same sorts of things. So you can kind of, it puts us in a nice mind frame of understanding the kind of complexity, the kind of confusion, the kind of fear that people were living in during that time. Now, I want to highlight one particular New Deal program. It was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and that was one of FDR's favorite programs, if not his favorite. And it was sometimes called the Tree Army. And I want to highlight this one because it shows kind of the model that all the New Deal programs were sort of focused on and centered about. And that is to try to create win-win situations as much as possible. And the way the CCC worked was this. It took young men, 18 to 24-year-olds, out of the cities and put them out in the wilderness. Out there, they would clear underbrush. They would make roads through the forest so that if there was a fire, the trucks and workers could get out there. They would build fire towers. They would dig ditches. They would build small bridges. They would build camp grounds. They would build welcome centers for national parks out in the wilderness. So these were all the kinds of things that these guys were doing. These were things that needed to be done, and these young men were looking for work. So we'll give them the work to do that. By taking them out of the city, what you've done is you've alleviated one mouth to feed in each of the families that send somebody out there. So if you've got an 18-year-old son, can't find work in the city, but he's at the dinner table every night, rather than send him out to be a hobo, send him out to the CCC, where he will begin to work on these projects. Now, while he's out there working on the projects, he's getting 3 square meals a day, plenty of exercise, and he's learning some work skills. He's learning how to do carpentry. He's learning how to do surveying. He's learning how to do purchasing. He's learning how to do simple blueprints and plans and things like that. All great skills for a young person to have. And they wouldn't be getting these if they weren't in the CCC. 3 square meals, some skills, and on top of it, a warm, safe place to sleep at night. They also got paid roughly $1 a day, like $30 a month. So let's say you get $30 a month. 5 of that stayed with the young man at the camp. The other 25 was sent back home to mom and dad. And now mom and dad had a source of income. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough to take the edge off of things. Now, maybe they could pay the rent a little more easily. They could feed baby brother or baby sister. And when the son is still out in the camp, they are able to keep that $5, and now they're going to learn some very valuable lessons on money management. Because if the camp had a camp canteen where you could buy bubble gum and magazines and, simple little things like that, if you went in on the first day of the month when you got paid and you bought $5 worth of bubble gum and you chewed it all up in the first week and then went 3 weeks without bubble gum, you learned a very valuable lesson about how to make money last. And so these young men were learning job skills, they were getting the 3 meals a day, and they were also learning financial skills as well. Meanwhile, the communities were getting these things built for them. The cities were having young men taken out of the cities, which meant that the crime rate began to go down in many cities because crime is a young man's profession. Mom and dad have a little bit of extra income. Sis is getting a little bit better food. It's a win-win for everybody. And that was the idea behind most of these New Deal programs. How do we help the most number of people, and how do we help the most number of people in the broadest possible ways? Now, The other day I gave this talk and a gentleman asked me about, well, how did they know that the money was being spent, the right way on all these programs and these projects and such? And the way that Roosevelt took care of that was with things like the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. These were projects that were being done right in communities. So you could see what the government was doing for you right in your community. So the WPA might do things like build schools or hospitals or libraries. They might be putting in a new road, resurfacing a road, putting in a sidewalk, putting in street lights, putting in water filtration, those sorts of things. And you got a job working on that in your community. And every day you could say, well, you know what? I've got a little bit of a paycheck coming in and I'm contributing to my community. The government is contributing to my community by building this hospital, by building this school, by building, this post office. So people were able to see right in their own communities the good work that the government was doing. Now, the other thing about these New Deal programs is if you look at these, most of them are centered on jobs. Now, they all come back to creating jobs. Now, again, when we teach this from an economic standpoint, we teach students, well, you have to have jobs because these programs created jobs, which then gave these guys a paycheck, which then allowed them to go out and spend the money, which generated a demand in the economy, which was then, a good economic engine to get things moving again. And that is all completely and totally true. But Roosevelt also understood the importance of jobs in the standpoint of giving people a purpose, a sense of doing, a purpose for being. Remember, we tend to define ourselves by our jobs, right? I'm a teacher, you're a banker, you're a lawyer, you're a bus driver. But if you lose those jobs, are you still a bus driver if you're not driving a bus? Are you still a teacher if there's no students to teach? So Roosevelt understood that we define ourselves and our self-worth and our self-image by the job that we do. And so by giving people jobs, suddenly folks had a purpose, a reason to get up every morning and something to do and a reason to do that. Now, did the New Deal work? Well, my answer to that would be yes, but on a scale. Some things worked far better than others. Right? The whole idea of Roosevelt's administration was bold, persistent experimentation. If nothing else, try something. If it works, stick with it. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. Nothing to fear but fear itself. Let's get this stuff moving. Let's get this stuff going. And that's exactly what the New Deal did. And if you asked people from that time period, who was, let's say, working for the CCC or working on the WPA project or the Tennessee Valley Authority, their lives were not dramatically changed from they were living on the street to they were living in a mansion, but they were able to get off the street and into some housing. And they didn't starve in the meantime. And they had a purpose for getting up in the morning. And those communities gained by the projects that the government was doing. So did it work? Yes, to varying degrees, some things better than others, but it had the overarching effect, which was to get the country moving again, get people jobs, get people paychecks going through as well. Did the New Deal end the Great Depression? No, it didn't. It took World War II to do that. Right? Once World War II came along and we were dragged into it, the young men were put in uniforms and sent off to Europe or Asia to fight the war. Young women took to the factories as Rosies and created all the machines and the material and the weapons and the tanks and the uniforms and all that not only the United States needed, but also our allies needed as well. And we were able to go from something like 14th or 17th behind Portugal on the day of infamy, December 7th, 1941. That's where we were ranked, somewhere I've seen anywhere from 14 to 17 behind Portugal in military strength. The United States went from there to arsenal of democracy within about 18 months or so, supplying not only our own war needs, but the war needs and the food needs of much of the rest of the world at that time. And I would argue that it was the New Deal programs that allowed us to do that. The fact that we did not lose a generation of workers, the fact that we began to invest in our infrastructure, that we got our farms back in shape, that we got our factories back working, that we built the infrastructure that we needed. We had the electricity, the roads, the waterways, the rail lines, the airports, the ports. We had all those things that when the war came along, we were able to then gear these things up and produce the weapons and the material needed in order to fight the Nazis. Some parts of the New Deal are no longer with us. The National Recovery Administration was declared unconstitutional because it was setting prices and things, and that was seen as not the job of the government, but the job of the market. But many of the things that we have in our society today, the world that we live in, were created through the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs. Things that have become so a part of our lives, we don't even think about a time when they didn't exist. Things like Social Security, the FDIC, which never clicked with my grandma, but it makes me feel a lot better knowing that the money that I have in the bank, little as it is protected. Securities and Exchange Commission, right, which has eliminated a lot of fraud in Wall Street. Now, some of these things have been chipped away, and there's still some stuff that goes on with this, but there had been nothing up to that point. And now all of a sudden there was. Even the communication that we use, the FCC, which originally started out with radio broadcasts, and regulating the airwaves and those sorts of things, now, help to regulate the internet and how we're able to work with that. The minimum wage, 40-hour work week, the OSHA, right, safety standards for workers, unions, all these things came about through Roosevelt and the New Deal and the Great Depression. So I hope that encapsulates a little understanding of what the Great Depression was like, what the causes of the Great Depression were, and what Roosevelt was looking to do first with this first 100 days, which then set the tone for the rest of his administration. Of course, by 1940, 1939, 1940, the war came along, and his priorities shifted from some of the social programs on the home front here to fighting the war and defeating the Nazis. But these were the driving forces that were behind the New Deal and Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. And changed our perspective and our relationship with our government. The government took on the role of looking after the economic well-being of the American citizens, through minimum wages, through labor unions, through the protections in the workplace, those sorts of things. And it grew government, it expanded government, and it made for a more stable society in terms of economic disaster. We haven't had a Great Depression since the Great Depression. We had a Great Recession, but no Great Depression in the last 80 years, in large measure because of these safety net programs that Roosevelt put into place. We could argue some went too far. We could argue some didn't go far enough. We could argue some lasted too long. We could argue that some need to be reformed. But we can't argue that they got us through the difficult times of the Great Depression, and they got us through in a way that we went from 1932 with 1,000 banks and farms failing a day to 1945, where we were one of only 2 superpowers left in the world. Pretty good for one presidential administration. Now let's take a look and see if we have any questions here. Let's see. One person says, my great-grandfather was homeless under Hoover administration. He got a job and a home thanks to FDR and the New Deal. That's exactly right. That is a story that is repeated thousands and thousands and thousands of times, where people got jobs that made all the difference, right? Didn't make them rich, but it made all the difference in what they were able to do and whether or not they ended up having a better quality of life. Let's see. I think this time will affect the young children as they grow up in a similar way the generation grew up in the Great Depression. I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. When you think about people from the Great Depression, and my grandmother really stands out in my mind because she was really, really impacted by this. And I remember her doing things, and I talked to people and they say, "Oh, my grandmother did the same thing." Taking string off the cake box and wrapping it up, putting it in the drawer because you never knew when you were going to need it. Flattening out aluminum foil and washing it off and using it because you never knew when you were going to get more. As a matter of fact, my grandmother had a saying, and the saying was, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." And she always said that to us when we were kids. So one year we got her this little plaque, and she had it hanging in her house. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Because Granny was always telling us to make sure that we did that. And I think that you're right. I think the folks that are going through what we're going through right now are certainly going to remember 2 months of shutdown, 2 months of being locked down, and the fear and the anxiety and the uncertainty that comes about through this kind of situation. And the other thing is, my mother-in-law was telling me one time that they were poor when she grew up during the Great Depression, but they didn't even realize they were that poor because everybody was poor. So the fact that we're all kind of going through this together, I think is a nice thing, because it will create an entire generation that will carry these lessons through throughout the rest of their lives. Let's see, what else do we have here? Let's see. Here's somebody who studied the Depression and Dust Bowl while at a university, and an amazing president, very proactive, inspired the U.S., one of the great presidents. Well, those of us that work there certainly think so. Here was the guy that got us through the Great Depression and got us through the World War. And again, we can argue around the edges of, there were good things, he should have done this or should have done that, or there were bad things that he should have done here or there. But taken as a totality, what Roosevelt really did was reshape the American presidency in a way that set us up in a really great position for the rest of the 20th century. And beyond. And every day we're using bridges and roads and water systems and things and parks that were and airports that were created during the New Deal, the Great Depression. Let's see. Oh, somebody admiring the periodic table. Yes, thank you very much. That was put together by a couple of interns that we had working for us maybe about 10 or 15 years ago. One of them, Sarah Malcolm, was such a great intern that she later applied for a job and we hired her. And what I like about the Great Depression's New Deal periodic table is that it really shows in one big spot, that the Great Depression was a big deal and the New Deal was a big deal, right? It gives you, you can list out a couple of programs here and there, but when you see it all laid out in front of you like this, it's absolutely amazing. And there's not just the periodic table of the New Deal. We also have a periodic table for World War II as well, because World War II was also, as you know, a big deal. And we are currently trying to get some funding to work on some electronic versions of these. We've sent out over 10,000 of these all around the world. They're hanging in classrooms all around the world, and we're working on an electronic version so that the teachers will be able to pull it up in a classroom, hover over the box, and up will come a photo, a document, an object. So stay tuned for that as well. Let's see. Frances Perkins was instrumental in this too. First woman in the cabinet. Absolutely. Frances Perkins, one of my favorite people of the 20th century. Not only was she the first woman in the presidential cabinet, she was one of only 2 people in the Roosevelt administration that stayed throughout the entire 12 years. Harold Ickes was the other. And Frances Perkins was so awesome because, she has an incredible story. She wanted to be a teacher, and then she ended up becoming a social worker, and then ended up becoming, Secretary of Labor. And one of the cool things was that she was put in charge of a committee called the Committee on Economic Security. And they were charged with finding out what were the problems that were, making people in the country economically unstable. And she went out, she put this committee together, they created a report. The report was so complete that when she turned it into the president, 2 days later, within 48 hours, it was drafted into the Social Security Act. So Frances Perkins, totally one of my heroes. Let's see here. people talking about how the New Deal also helped artists. That's exactly right. I think it was Mr. Hopkins who said that artists have to eat too, and so one of the job programs, I think called Federal One, which is one of the New Deal programs, was to give out-of-work artists work. So if you were a musician and you weren't playing anywhere, the government would hire you to play concerts for people, and to put on plays and to write guidebooks for for states, for trails and those sorts of things, to write plays, to put on plays, to do dancing. So the arts, it had two purposes. Again, this idea of Roosevelt win-win. It created art which lifted people's spirits during the Great Depression. It created jobs for these artists, and it allowed them to develop their talents during these dark years of the Great Depression. So that in this very important time of development, they were able to exercise their talents and develop those. And people like one of the most famous, I guess, would be Orson Welles. Came out of this. So this was again one of these things that was a win-win for everybody. Talking about the WPA murals, yes, beautiful murals. Again, getting artists to come in and paint these beautiful murals in public spaces that are still enjoyed by people today, all around the country. We have quite a few here in the Hudson Valley, particularly the Hyde Park Post Office. And what else do we have here? Let's see. Oh, somebody asked, what about some programs or projects for the WPA here in Dutchess County? Well, it's interesting that Dutchess County is the only county in the country that has 5 post offices that were built by the WPA. So, coincidence that it happens to be in FDR's county? Well, maybe, but he knew how to take care of people, and he knew how to look after people, and so we have that. And I think because of his relationship with Mayor LaGuardia, a lot of money poured into New York City as well, to do things like the Lincoln Tunnel and the airports, those sorts of things. So Roosevelt was a keen politician, and he knew where these things were going to get good play. He knew how to create the jobs for people, and again, these things were right smack dab in your neighborhood, in your community, where you were able to see how the government was impacting you and making your life a little bit better place. Somebody's asking, what would I consider to be the most important lasting New Deal program? Well, I would probably have to say Social Security. And I say that not as my personal preference, although I think it's super duper important, but I think Roosevelt felt that was one of his most important domestic programs. I think he felt Social Security was his most important domestic program, and the creation of the United Nations was his most important international, achievement and contribution. Social Security has helped so many people in so many ways. When you think about all the unemployed folks right now during the shutdown, where do they get this money? Where is this coming from? It's coming from unemployment insurance, which is part of what Social Security was. I had a friend growing up in high school, and his dad died, and he got survivor benefits as a result of that. Certainly not the same as having your dad there, but it certainly eased the pain and some of the uncertainty financially in that family and such. So I think Social Security is probably the one that has had the largest impact, and is kind of the most important, at least as far as I would say, and I think FDR felt that as well. Let's see. Did FDR despise Hoover? Well, it depends. I don't think he despised Hoover, but some of it depends upon when you're talking about. Hoover and FDR were actually friends early on. They had both worked in the Wilson administration. FDR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and I forget what Hoover did, but he was there as well. And at one point, Roosevelt even thought Hoover would make a good president. The problem was that, as they became political rivals, they had different views as to how the world was was working and how the government should work. So I don't think so much that they were enemies, is that they had these different perspectives. And I think that each of them felt that they had the right idea. Hoover was, look, let's just wait it out. Let the, market mechanism come in. There's no reason for government to get all crazy and get all this, government spending and all this, government tentacles in everybody's business. But Roosevelt said, hey, you know what? We've waited how many years now? It hasn't happened. We have to get out there and make this sort of happen. Now, I do know for a fact that Roosevelt never invited Hoover back to the White House. And when Roosevelt died, that was one of the first things Harry Truman did, was invite Hoover back. He did that because Hoover was the only other surviving president at the time. So, he was the only other person who understood the position that Harry Truman was in, the only other surviving president. And that was the first time that Hoover had been invited back to the White House since he had left that morning of inauguration on March 4th. And I understand that he was so moved by the invitation that he cried. And of course, Truman was so thankful that he came to meet with him, because there was nobody else he could talk to that understood the complexities of the problem of being president of the United States. What constitutes a depression as opposed to a recession? Well, Harry Truman once said, a recession, let's see, let me if I get this right. A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job. And that's kind of a smarty pants answer. A recession, I believe, is 2 consecutive downturns in the economic indicators, 2 quarters in a row. And then a depression is a longer lasting recession, where the downturn continues and it gets worse. And then, of course, you're hoping to bring about a recovery. Now, an economist, I'm sure, would argue with that. That's just a sort of a general explanation of what it is. But a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of downturn. FDR was the greatest president. Can't argue with that. He pays my bills. Let's see, New Deal programs let's see, New Deal programs were often criticized for men leaning on shovels. Was there corruption, and what kinds of oversights existed? Well, that's a good question. That's what the critics said. It's make work. These jobs aren't really necessary. These guys are just leaning on shovels, that sort of thing. But the amount of infrastructure these folks created over an 8 to 12 year period, there wasn't much time to be leaning on shovels. And the oversight really came from 2 things. One was that these programs were administered locally. So, and that's partly because they were, the ideas for the New Deal programs were generated here in New York. So that was pretty local. And so these programs were administered locally. So in each community, you knew who the movers and shakers were and who the people that weren't going to be such movers and shakers. And so the folks that were put in charge tended to be these movers and shakers, right? You want something done and, in a certain, in a certain village, you go to the McGillicuddies, because the McGillicuddies always get the job done. And so that's how these things were kind of set up. The other accountability and oversight was the fact that everybody in that village is walking by that project every day. And so they better be seeing a hospital going up. They better be seeing a school going up. And so the proof was really in the pudding with a lot of this. My grandmother made her kids clothes and toys for Christmas, and they didn't own a car until after the war. Yeah, it was lean times. It was tough times. I remember, again, my grandma talking about how, she would get an orange for Christmas, and she would break it open and they would eat like 1 section, a day to make it last throughout the entire week. Okay, lots of great questions. Experience as a governor certainly helped him out. It absolutely did. Roosevelt had 2 dress rehearsals for the presidency. The first was he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. So that came in very handy when he became commander-in-chief during the Second World War. He knew how to get men and ships and supplies across oceans to fight enemies. The other dress rehearsal was he was the governor of New York during the first 4 years of the Great Depression, and so he had a sense of these kinds of programs that would work and would be able to create the jobs and have the impact that he was hoping to have. And so that's exactly what he was looking to do. And he had that experience, both of those two little dress rehearsals, which made him a really effective person in office when it came time to get things done. Okay, let's see. Where did FDR get many of his ideas to save the country during the Great Depression? Well, FDR was one of these guys that had a lot of good ideas himself, but he also was very much surrounded by people with good ideas. And so he got these ideas from a lot of different folks, Harold Ickes, Harry Hopkins, Francis Perkins, Ray Moley, all these kinds of folks were what he called the brain trust. And so these guys came up with these ideas, and they brought them to Roosevelt, and then Roosevelt would listen to these ideas, and he would say, okay, well, let's try this, let's try that. He was kind of the jury on making the decisions as to which the programs would be created and administered. And many of the ideas for these things had actually bubbled up starting in the neighborhoods, bubbling up through neighborhoods, through villages, through cities, through counties. That's kind of how the progressive movement got started. And then, you saw which ones worked and you went with those. You saw which ones didn't work. And, you either tweaked them so they did work, or you abandoned them and tried something else that did work. So he got ideas from many, many places. And of course, again, a lot of it stemming from these dress rehearsals that he had as governor and as assistant secretary of the Navy. Okay, so we're just about out of time. Let me just see if we've got one more here we could do. Lots of people saying we could use an FDR now. Well, we certainly, he was certainly the right man for the right time, and he had the right skills, he had the right disposition, he had the right people around him, and he had the right vision for America at the time. So I certainly agree that he was the right man for the job. Okay. All right, and that's about all we've got time for today. Listen, I hope you've enjoyed this, giving you a little oversight of what the Great Depression was, what caused it, and how Roosevelt tried to minimize the impact on people. Of course, we have a whole library and museum dedicated to telling this story right here in Hyde Park, New York. So please come and visit us when we get open again. Bring your kids, bring your parents, bring your neighbors. There's lots of story to discover and lots of information to gain from visiting not just the galleries, but also from doing research in our research room. So please come back and do that with us when we're able to do that. But in the meantime, stay tuned here to our website. You can do our virtual tour. We've got these programs going on every Wednesday, and we've got all kinds of ways that we're trying to reach out through social media to keep you all involved and to let you know the story of the Roosevelts. It's an incredible, incredible story that we can draw lots of inspiration from, not just politically, but personally in these hard and tough times. I always describe the Roosevelts as futurists. And what I mean by that is that they saw where they were and they understood the conditions that they were dealing with, whether it was Nazis or Great Depression or polio. They weren't Pollyannas. They knew when they were in trouble, but they were futurists. They saw where they wanted to be. They saw where they wanted the country to be. They saw where they wanted the world to be. And then they worked hard every single day, building a bridge from where they were to where they wanted to be. And that's all you can do each day. Get up and make the world a little bit better place, move a little bit further down the line, make happen what you can make it happen where you are. And if all of us do that in our own way, in our own place, the world becomes a better place. And that's what's going to get us through this crisis there as well. So take a lesson from the Roosevelts, see where we are, imagine where we're going to be, and then let's work our way to getting there. Thanks so much for spending this hour with me, and we'll see you again, here on social media and at the library when we open again. Bye-bye.